when I started that job, we had 300 state bills per year that were mostly anti-drone, restricting or prohibiting the drone use. And so we got involved in defending against those and defeating those proposals across many, many states, and implementing model drone policy that still exists in about 15 states covering half the population. So if you look at state drone law, we were there.
In this episode of Behind the Tech, I talked with Brandon Schulman, one of the top legal minds in the drone industry. Watch on to find out how his advocacy helped shape the drone regulation landscape across the world. Today, my guest is Brandon Schulman. You work at Boston Dynamics. You're the VP of Policy. And you've been working in the drone industry for a while before you moved into Boston Dynamics. You're practically a legend. You are. Oh. I've asked around. Everyone knows you. And it's because you've done a lot of good stuff for the drone industry in general. And I want to touch on a lot of things today, a lot of policy, because I think it's really critical for moving the industry forward. But before we get into all of that, I want to talk about you. Like, I want the audience to know you. Like, what motivates you to do the things that you're doing right now? Mm-hmm. And to get started, how did you actually get into drones? Because I couldn't find any info on that.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's great to be on the podcast. Really, the story of me and drones goes all the way back about 25 years when I started becoming a model aircraft enthusiast. So I was really just someone who liked to build and fly model airplanes. And then I had this opportunity as a lawyer in New York to take on some of the first cases involving the regulation of model airplanes, or what we now call drones, in the United States. So there were a couple of cases that came up, sort of famously the Rafael Perker case involving an FAA penalty, and then the Texas EquiSearch case that involved the use of model airplanes for volunteer search and rescue.
Yep.
This group in Texas was looking for missing kids, and I thought, wow, that's an amazing application that the government was telling them they couldn't do, it wasn't legal, wasn't allowed. So I took on these early advocacy cases, and so I went from this model aircraft enthusiast to someone who was working on the legal issues surrounding the new commercial uses for the same kinds of technology.
And obviously knowing the technology really helped you, put you in the spotlight there. And then in 2015, if I got my notes right, you got in touch with DJI, or did DJI get in touch with you? What happened there?
They started a search for someone who could address some of the emerging concerns coming from government. You might recall that was the year that a DJI drone landed on the White House lawn.
A Phantom, right?
Yeah, it was a Phantom, that's right. And I think they, and probably the larger industry, realized at that point that the government was going to have questions and concerns,
yeah.
and they needed someone who could address the law and policy that was coming up around the use of drones, but also someone who knew the technology and was passionate and really genuinely interested in defending and promoting the industry.
So would you say that the Phantom landing in the White House was what prompted DJI to lawyer up?
It was probably the single precipitating factor that caused them to realize they needed someone to do government policy, government relations work, and that started the search for someone to take that position.
Yeah, and like for the audience there, like maybe to put you in context, like DJI back in 2015 was still the largest, but there were other competing companies as well, and there was a community and a big industry forming back then. So this was a big issue because there was a lot of manufacturers.
Yep.
And what was your goal behind taking that job?
Yeah.
Like your personal goal first.
Yeah, no, the personal goal was really to continue what I'd already started as a lawyer individually, which is to advocate for the technology, for the people who would come to use and benefit from it. And I worked with many of those companies. So back then it was 3DR, Parrot, and GoPro, either in the drone industry on the consumer side or getting into it in the case of GoPro.
Yep.
And we worked great together. We started a trade association. We advocated for the interests of all users of the technology, particularly those kinds of systems. The stuff that you could buy and use today, rather than the stuff that was off in the distant future in terms of drone delivery, yeah. or these days passenger, yeah. drones. It was focused on innovation that was within reach.
Yeah, so back then there was drones that you could buy at Best Buy.
Yeah, that's right.
And they were using them as tools, which
yep.
was what caused this, this disconnect with regulation and the technology that we were using. So what type of policy that you helped drive while you were at DJI?
There were so many different things. Some of the categories we had when I started that job, we had 300 state bills per year that were mostly anti-drone, restricting or prohibiting the drone use. And so we got involved in defending against those and defeating those proposals across many, many states, and implementing model drone policy that still exists in about 15 states covering half the population. So if you look at state drone law, we were there. Federal legislation for the FAA was being done around that time, and there are provisions relating to micro drones that would allow them to be used more easily for commercial purposes. Then in later years, remote identification was a big policy issue, flight over people, and of course registration was probably the one thing that kicked it off the first year I was at DJI was the registration task force and trying to advise the FAA on how to register drones and which drones will be registered, how much would it cost, and how do you get it done.
So you mentioned advocate for good policy. Who were you advocating to?
The policymakers who were going to implement something. And that could have been a ban, it could have been a burden on operations, it could have been a restriction.
Okay, and that's U.S. government related?
It was a global role, right?
Okay.
So obviously I started off being based in the U.S. and most familiar with American policy, but DJI, given how global it was, it immediately was a global role. So I hired folks in Europe, in Asia Pacific, Australia, Japan, Korea. We were basically doing the same kinds of advocacy for reasonable policy worldwide. Again, with the interest being, if we can get the right policy in place, we can address the concerns, the legitimate concerns that people had about drones, including airspace safety and privacy and security, while not impairing the value of the technology. That was really my personal mission. And because I was running that for DJI, that was also DJI's mission, was we're going to advocate for anyone who wants to use a drone, because that's going to help our company, but it's also going to help the innovation in the industry.
Then you were pushing for better regulation for everyone. Why do you think there's a big anti-DJI sentiment?
I think it's just kind of popular to criticize and kind of a love-hate thing with the industry leader in any industry.
Yeah.
So pick your favorite industry. It could be Apple, it could be Tesla. Yeah, there's something about the market leader where I think people appreciate what they've done and the technology that they've delivered at a reasonable price, and that's why they're doing so well. But then there's also kind of like a sense that okay, so now I have no choice, or I'm tied to them, or you can't escape the impact and influence of a company that has that much of a market advantage.
Yep.
And I think that just sort of builds on itself. And it's a very natural thing. I think, you see that in everything from the popular people in high school to, sports teams that keep winning, how many people hate the Yankees and the Red Sox, and the Patriots. There's something about just kind of the cheering for the underdog.
Yeah, and people didn't just have anti-DJI sentiment. They also, you catch a lot of that fire for them as well. You became the spokesperson and the public target.
I had a very visible role, right? So sort of there were only a handful of U.S.-based visible people for DJI at that time. There was Michael Perry, there was myself, there was Romeo Dersher, and a few others. So of course, and I was dealing with government stakeholders and testifying in Congress and doing things that were very visible. So it was inevitable that some of those sentiments would be directed to me.
How do you deal with that personally?
To me, it's just part of the job. If you're going to work at the cutting edge of a new industry that's scaring people, either because people think that airliners are going to crash, or that the Chinese are spying on the American government, or that their daughters are being spied upon in the backyard swimming pool. If you're working in that kind of industry that raises all these concerns, some legitimate, some not, and you're the visible face of the company that leads that industry, to me, this is just the way it's going to be. You're going to get some of the heat inevitably. It's sort of inescapable.
Yeah. You mentioned China, and I can't let that pass because there was a big cybersecurity. I don't know. I don't know if it's misinformation or what was it, but everyone started reporting that the drones were leaking data and perhaps exposing more data than they should. And they started getting banned from some levels of the government. You were still there. How did you deal with that? It must have been quite the experience to have to educate and have to learn yourself the actual technology to be able to explain it to the regulators. So what did you do there?
It's a challenge because drones are scary to begin with. And then the allegation is that they are stealing or sending data to overseas adversaries. And so you have to try to prove the negative, which actually isn't really possible. So there are things that the company did that I think were helpful. There were different types of independent audits that really examined the security of the product. There was a collaboration with the Department of the Interior to create drone models called Government Edition that were totally offline and that couldn't send data anywhere. And that was sort of demonstrably true from the testing that the US government did. So you can try to prove a negative, but you can't deal with the politics. If the politics are just sort of twofold. Number one, Chinese company, so we're just never going to trust it.
Yeah.
Number two, well, you could update the software and then all the past testing is no longer appropriate or relevant to the current software. That's true. And number three, I think the honest issue there wasn't about data going anywhere. It was about dependence. And the US government, particularly the military, being uncomfortable with the notion that in order to, that it would rely upon Chinese suppliers for small quadcopters, which we now see, interestingly, in Ukraine, are quite effective in certain types of warfare scenarios, even though they're consumer or commercial products. And so that's an understandable concern, and there's not really anything you can do about that other than to foster competitors that can actually deliver a product that competes with DJI. And that, at least back then, hasn't really been possible. And so you see the policy reaction to that is to try to attack and ban and create a cloud of suspicion, not because I believed anything or ever saw a reason to think that data was going somewhere, but because they didn't like the idea that like 80% of the market was DJI and the next 5 or 10% was Autel. And so, wow, 90% of the market is Chinese. That's a problem if we ever go to war with China, right? I think that was the real issue there, and it wasn't about data security.
So it's more of a geopolitical situation happening. But would you say that the problems that you were facing back then on the drone industry were also similar to what any new emerging technology goes through every time, like let's say AI right now?
Yes. There's definitely the fear cycle. I think it's very intense right now on AI, both image and text generating technologies. I thought we had gotten past that in the drone industry because we had this cycle of aviation safety fears and backyard privacy fears. And those, I think, I and others in the industry did a lot to try to overcome that. And unfortunately, and I've said this in other contexts as I was leaving DJI, unfortunately, creating a new type of fear in the industry, the fear of Chinese spying drones, is not good for anyone. Because now the public, the government, has a new reason to be scared of any kind of drone. Because if you're worried about data going to China, what is that data? Is it sensitive? Is it private? Is it national security? If it is, we need to worry about all drones. Because even if you eliminate the Chinese drone, the kid down the street can buy an American drone and fly it in that sensitive location and send data anywhere, post it on YouTube, Instagram, and you've got, so either you do or you don't have a security fear that arises from drones, and if you do, now we have a whole problem for the industry, and maybe you're seeing it at the show we're at here, where now we're standing up cybersecurity initiatives and new programs to try to deal with a new fear that the industry itself created and lobbied in order to compete with DJI. I think that's kind of unfortunate. Personally.
Definitely. Like being a software engineer, talking about cybersecurity, I can tell you, the geopolitical issue aside, it's ridiculous that we're worrying about some of that stuff when we could be doing so much more to enhance what we already have and continue pushing that technology. And I want to thank you for pushing for all of that work in drone policy, because you did help everyone, and that's why I think you're a legend. And everyone in the comments will probably agree with me.
No.
So let's. I'm gonna have a good question here. So, what would you have done better if you could go back in time?
It's such a hard question. I think I would have started earlier with a grassroots movement. I think I would have pushed, because I think the value of the community is the people using the technology who've got the stories to tell. And it's hard to engage them. On the one hand, it's just a tool. They're taking a picture. On the other, those are the people who are most impacted by all these policies we've discussed, whether it's registration, remote ID, the China policies that are now impeding agencies in Florida. Like, it's the end users that really have those stories. So I think if I could have, and I think it would have been hard, I would have put more emphasis on developing the grassroots and the grass tops, as they're called, advocates, so that the industry had a collective voice, and it wasn't just DJI or a handful of trade associations advocating on behalf of the industry. Like, let's see the community side.